you. Well, first off, thanks everybody for coming. Just wanted to get an idea, how many here are students? Oh, okay. How many are visual effects working professionals? Okay, all right. And any directors or other types of people here? Okay. All right, okay, all right. Good, just so I have an idea. Okay, so I was asked to talk about visual effects innovation from analog days to digital days, but I don't want to do an historical review, as it were. So what I'm hoping to talk about is some of the innovation just in terms of the thought processes in the days before digital, and then talk about some of the things going on in digital, and more importantly, how that relates to storytelling, and just trying to get the most out of your visual effects. So, as mentioned, one of the first professional project I started on was called Watch the Skies. I was hired by Douglas Trumbull as his assistant because I come from a background in the Midwest, and I was into a number of different things: model railroading, animation, et cetera, et cetera. This is before Star Wars or any of those types of things, and I was into photography and art. So with a wide variety of backgrounds, I became interested in doing visual effects, since I knew that that was going to be something different every day, which it turned out to be. So I started on Watch the Skies, which ended up being called Close Encounters. So my first day on the job, Doug said, look, for this movie, we need to create clouds. The script calls for these specific clouds with flying saucers and so forth in them. So when we pour cream in our coffee, we can see little clouds there, but we need to actually be able to photograph it. And at that time, we were very limited in terms of smoke type of effects, because there was an AV smoke, but that was poisonous, and there are a few other things. But they wanted to get cumulus clouds, so they gave me $20 in petty cash, and they gave me a 20-gallon aquarium. So the end of the week, I developed a method to create clouds. And I'll cover part of that. But that was the exciting thing then, is you had to think outside the box, literally, with everything that you had to come up against. So in order to deal with that, I used some knowledge from science fairs and science and so forth, and came up with a methodology. And this was also bouncing ideas off the people at the company there that were working on the film, where I had specific gravity. We ended up building a 7-foot by 7-foot by 4-foot tank, clear glass tank, and we had two basically large wine vats of 2,000 gallons each, and constantly being filtered. So we would fill half the tank with salt water, half the tank with fresh water, and then we'd go ahead and inject fresh water temper paints into that. And we had, this atomic arm. Basically, they used it for remote manual moving things, and Doug would go in there and press a button, and we had it rigged up with hoses and so forth, so it would eject. We also had a fiber optic running through so we could have light to it. And then I would typically go behind and put in with a little syringe force perspective clouds in the background. And here just shows a photo of this setup. Now, we were shooting everything on 65 millimeter, and that was one of the limitations of pre-digital, because you were going to make a copy of a copy of a copy. So it was important to try to start with the best copy. At ILM, during the same time, they were doing Star Wars, and they were doing VistaVision. So they were shooting with a larger negative as well, which was 35 millimeter running horizontally. So I'll just show a clip from the film if I can. So you can see the light effects going on and so forth. And notice the simple shot designs, but how effective they are. So we could filter the fiber optics to make it any color that we wanted. And this was also during a period where you weren't seeing a visual effects film every weekend. So, you know, so it had a much bigger impact certainly at that time. So we could shoot at different frame rates with different pressure levels to get different amounts of cumulus effect and different speeds out of that. So these are two different plates, and we flopped one. Okay, so, and so I'll focus a little bit in terms of the old days, old school techniques on close encounters. Thanks. So next up, I'll talk a little bit about the Mothership. I photographed all the Mothership shots with Dennis Murin in a room half the size, I guess. And I'll get into some of those details, but just talking about how we achieve some of the different things. So you'll notice an upside down R2-D2 right there. So Stephen had brought George by at one point during it and showing different things. So that weighed like 300 pounds. And then this is a different model. I'll go into the detail about how we achieve some of the different looks and so forth. So those are basically cigar tubes that the model builders have been drilling holes on for weeks on end. We have tiny neon inside, and this was before LEDs, so everything's little light bulbs. You know, and as I say, the entire model was about 6 feet across. Let me jump ahead here. So we shot the bottom as a separate element, and it's basically like a 6-foot dome. We had it on its side. Everything that you did, you had to think, how are we going to photograph this? Because that's how we got all the images that we needed made. So to do this, we ended up with a projector from Germany, which took, I believe, 5 by 5 inch. We also had a 10 by 10. Essentially two large slides, if you will. And we projected this pattern on the bottom. And this, as you could see there, they actually had artists drawing specific patterns, but this kind of gives you an idea. This was a moire pattern, so it's rotating against itself, creating this complex scene, or this complex texture. And actually, I tend to use this even for some of the things today digitally, like creating distant fires and things like that. You guys probably don't remember, but they used to have like Coca-Cola signs and things where they had animation going on, and all that was just generated by slots and moire patterns and things like that. But even today, you can use that to create very complicated things. And I guess that's part of what I'm hoping to talk about today, is some of the different ways of thinking about things and not necessarily saying, okay, everything's got to be digital. So this is how we did the bottom of the Mothership, that little white glow that went on the bottom and animated around. We essentially had a motorized XY table on the side, which was like a slit scan. I don't know if you can see the arrow. No, okay. All right, on the left side, you'll see the artwork there. We had a photocell, so as that thing was motorized across, the photocell would see that, would cause the shutter to open down here, and the fiber optic, the light would go through that, and that was motorized to go around the circle of this thing. So it would turn on and off, and as the artwork animated each time, then it would cause the lights to move and shift around or to split apart. This shows it. Shows the light effect going on. So we had to think in terms of slow motion, stop motion, reverse action. You know, we just had to be able to rethink in different ways. And at the bottom, you would see those colored bars with the timing. So I also shot on the animation stand. So Robert Swarth, our animation supervisor, would rig up these little things out of cardboard. That's what this represents, 2 cardboard flags, essentially, with just pivot points. And you know, they'd have an animation sheet, so I'd move to position 2 on this one, position 3 on that, and just continue with that way. And then for the room, we had to get that smoke, so that was actually vaporized oil, and we had a 40-watt light bulb across the room, and I had a spot meter, and we would measure it and pull a rope, which would cause more steam to, you know, more vaporized oil to be pumped out into the room. So, whoops, let me go back. And this just shows, we also employed front projection on this, so that's actually the background back there. So that meant that you had to create the background before you did the foreground plates. And even today, it's much better when you can shoot the backgrounds first so you can light correctly. And then, so that was all a miniature background. And this is an entire miniature plate. So let me just jump to that. And we would make these forced perspective models. So I'd trace that on a lithograph, and we'd project that through the camera. We'd put a light inside the camera, project it down so it matched the lens angle correctly. And the model builders would trace it out and then build models. And because this was forced perspective, the front road might be a foot in width, but we might have a building in the background that might, a 2-story house that might be an inch tall. So the other thing during this time period, motion control started to happen. So Star Wars and Close Encounters were some of the first examples of motion control. Now, for Star Wars and for this, for Close Encounters, we use motion control for all the flying ships. But Close Encounters, I believe, was one of the first electronic motion control systems. If you notice, there's a pan here and a focus pole. And this was in 1976, I guess we shot. You know, so that was one of the first times. And this was without a computer. This was all just digital and recording the digital data onto cassette tape. So it was still a rather primitive methodology. Let's see. And so this was part of the trailer. So the front road is about 2 feet at the start. The mountains are 2 feet tall, and I'm laying behind those mountains, controlling the rheostat that controls the light. You know, just a different way of approaching problem solving and coming up with different ways of doing this rather than saying, okay, we're going to go ahead and do it this way, and we're going to model this, and we're going to render it and go through this whole process. We would just sit there and do multiple takes with different settings. So innovation in the pre-digital days, we had to deal with physics, we had to deal with materials, lighting, photography, motion. We had to understand all of those notions and how best to do it. And when a project came in, you had to really think about, well, how are we going to do this? What's the best possible way? And that might mean, oh, I've got to shoot upside down and I've got to reverse the footage, I've got to do this other thing, or we're going to do it as a miniature, but what scale of miniature? All of those things you had to start taking a look at. Now, as we transitioned into digital, and that when I was at DreamQuest, had started investigating image processing because I knew that there was a lot of power there, but even video at that time was still analog. So when I went to work at ILM, they were just in the process of spinning off Pixar. And we started up working on young Sherlock Holmes, which was one of the first CG characters, as it were. But part of the problem is their scanner wasn't very good. But I talked to Dennis and some of the other people up there because I understood, what the digital would mean to us, and I was essentially hired to bring in a lot of technology and so forth, bring them up to date. So digital, we all know at this point has a lot of precision of control, full freedom of manipulation, match moving, all the other things that were extremely difficult to do in the old days. So one of the first things that we had to do was develop a digital scanner that was reliable and so forth. So we actually, for Willow, I contacted a document scanner. We modified it and used it for that project. But I then subsequently worked with Kodak, and we developed a input scanner that was 2K and 8-bit, and we had to work up the whole log system and the rest of it at that time. And from there, that's all the DI and everything else that you see, and Kodak spun off and then made Cinesite and the rest of it. So that was the starting point, and I got a technical award for that from the Academy. But with digital innovation, you've got animation tools, renders, rigs. You've got quite a bit of innovation in the last 20 years of digital. Now, one of the downsides with all that, and you've got match moving, composite, as you notice, most of the old stuff, pre-digital, as it were, was locked off because it was extremely difficult if you had to move the camera or do anything else. But some of the downsides of the digital innovation is it's almost all software based. And that means a very narrow set of skills and a narrow group of crew working on it. In the old days, you would have a model builder working with somebody else and working with the director of photography, and we'd figure things out. These days, a lot of times you go, okay, we'll just let the software guys work out a little thing to change the pixels and so forth. And these days, sometimes we're a little too focused on just the digital solutions because there's almost no visual effects houses these days that actually have an entire model shop. And a lot of places don't even have little insert stages for shooting elements and things. The other problem you run into is everybody thinks it's easy. Oh, well, we can do anything with pixels, so we'll just have somebody write some software. And I write software as well, but it's a different mentality, a different viewpoint. So sometimes it's great to be able to get in there and get your hands on it, and it's more rewarding, and sometimes you can achieve more with that. Because a lot of times with digital, we may spend days or weeks working on simulations, whereas we could go into a stage and just shoot something in an hour and shoot 20 variations of a dust hit or something else that might be a much more effective way to do it and give us a lot more flexibility. So all of this innovation has led to improvements or more possibilities in terms of storytelling. Because the reason for visual effects is to be able to tell visual stories. Otherwise, it's just eye candy. And unfortunately, these days, we get a lot of eye candy. But writing itself provides total freedom. An author can go ahead and write down, okay, the man turns into a cockroach, or they changed into this thing, and then the boy flew off on the broom, et cetera, et cetera. And they're wide open into what they can do. And a lot of those types of stories, whether it's biblical myths, fantasy, science fiction, fairy tales, and so forth, are, the writer has no limitations. But when it comes to creating those in a moving version, especially in a motion picture video version, there's a time and cost associated with creating those moving images. And the other thing that's different, obviously, from the written word to the visual word is once you've created a photographic version of that, you've kind of locked into it. You've taken the responsibility to imagine away from the audience, and you're doing it yourself. So you have to be aware of that and trying to make the best calls. Just like everybody read Harry Potter, but everybody had a slightly different vision of the main character and what that meant and what that looked like and so forth. Or even the fairy tales when you hear somebody, been eaten by a wolf and then cut open, a child can have a different view of that than an adult. But once you put that into a photographic type of image, then that becomes locked in their mind. Now, visual effects, as we know, have started, in the early days of movies with MENACE and others, because they were trying to tell stories. And he was able to tell quite a few fantasy stories. And when I say fantasy, I also mean period pieces, anything that you can't just simply shoot out of the box today. Now, the fact is, all films from Hollywood now use visual effects, whether it's a buddy movie or a romantic comedy, they all involve a certain amount of visual effects. So it's not just the big tent poles, although we tend to spot it as such. So the visual effects, all the innovation has led to the possibility of doing movies that couldn't have been done before and not done well, suppose. I worked on Dragonheart, and that only became possible because we'd done Jurassic Park. Because that script had been sitting on the shelves at the studio for over 7 years, and then, once they saw Jurassic Park, they said, oh, now we can make our movie. Because they had done a test with Jim Henson's group and so forth, and that's a different look, a different style. You would have had to go with puppets or stop motion, and would have been a different style, or you could do it full animation, but it's kind of a different thing. Each of those is a different genre or different methodology of storytelling. Benjamin Button was a movie that couldn't have been made years ago. Avatar and Gravity, those types of things could not have been made in the pre-digital days, not to the same quality level and not to the same flexibility. Now, those of us in the visual effects industry realized that you could make Avatar before they'd actually made Avatar. And likewise, we realized you could do something like Gravity before they made Gravity. But it took, ideally a director with at least some vision and understanding and willingness to do those types of projects. Because there's other types of projects that could be done, but the directors have not chosen or not been able to take advantage of that in the way that they should. So the benefits of visual effects, obviously for filmmakers, it allows them to tell any story they want visually. They're no longer locked in. They may not have the budget, and there are ways to deal with low budget visual effects as well. We've made the impossible possible. So anything a writer can dream up these days, we could probably recreate on screen. In many cases, we're providing the least expensive method to obtain the image. I mean, heck, if it was cheaper for them to build an entire castle, they would do it. But they're using visual effects because they want matte painting or they want a miniature or something that's going to be more cost effective. I mean, that's the only reason why they're doing it. The other, that's the main reason. The other reason, of course, is because they couldn't do it any other way. You can't have flying people without special effects and visual effects working together. So, and of course, we've allowed the filmmakers and the studios to be able to do these large tentpole movies, which there are more and more of, and that's what provides most of their profits during the course of the year, and that's why the studios are now focused on them, and that's a whole nother discussion. And here's just a sampling of some of the different types of shots and things that have been done. Trying to do the moving composites and make it that clean, distorting people, taking people's heads, attaching them to CG bodies. All of these things would have been incredibly difficult to do well in the analog days. And certainly Ray Harryhausen is one of my heroes, and it was inspired by his work, but it would have been difficult to achieve. And these are all miniatures here. There's a mix of both old and new, which is the other thing I try to point out to people is, you can mix them, and we need to make sure that we work well with the special effects people, the stunt people, and the rest of it. So just trying to allow all those little nuances, and this is like 20 years old now. So just getting that flexibility for the filmmakers. Now, oddly enough, some of the filmmakers are still not getting the picture because even after Life of Pi came out, the director said, well, yeah, but it's too expensive. Well, but we allowed a story, a book that nobody thought could have been done as a movie to be done. And yet here's some other things we once again, as visual effects people, this was originally designed as a wider shot, all CG pants. So when they pull out the things, the pants would stretch out and so forth. And anything we can do on the stage, and as opposed to me doing it, I much prefer if we can do it that way. So Jim Carrey was wearing loose suit pants, and the director was framing everything above the knees. So I said, let's just cut the pants. We'll cut the pockets, and we'll have two PAs pushing stuff up through the pockets. The costume designer wasn't too happy because she only had another pair of pants, but that's what we did. So there's a lot of cases where we end up with certain types of things and we come up with simple solutions. Sometimes in the days of digital, we try to come up with the most complicated solution where we should be looking at the entire selection of tools. So visual storytelling. So visual storytelling, in a script, when you're writing the script, you've got to make sure every scene counts. There's got to be a story point that's being told. And it's the same thing with visual effects. You've got to make sure every image counts because they cost money, they take time, so we want to get the most out of them. And that all starts with the design. The design is critical. The concept art, the storyboards, the previs, all of that is critical to what we do to achieve the best looking movie and to tell the story in the best way possible. These days, the directors tend to try to throw everything at the shots, and they try to turn it into everything including the kitchen sink. And in that way, sometimes you lose from the newer films because you go, was that Superman 39 or Spider-Man 21? Because you just see these ads one after the other, and you think, well, okay, I'm destroying another city, so which city of the week is this? Whereas if you look in, some of the older movies, like you have iconic shots, like from Star Wars with the Empire ship going overhead. So I think we all as filmmakers and visual effects people should try to just keep in mind, design ideas and so forth. Now, here was a case where the studio wanted everything to be perfectly smooth, and obviously one of the things that we have to sell is the impossible. And you're trying to sell a half-mile hole in the ground, and if everything's smooth and you've got nothing to relate to, then it just looks like a fake thing. So, and it has no scale. So in this case, I said, okay, we've got to put in some mist coming up. We've got to put in at least some cracks and other things to set up scale. And there's a lot of things where you see things and you go, well, exactly what is that? How big is it? And those are things that are kind of unique to visual effects because most of the production designers and other things don't deal with some of those types of issues. And of course, you've got storyboarding and so forth. Now, one of the advantages of storyboards, even over previs in some cases, but some of the things to think about, the storyboards clarify the director's vision for all the key creatives. And some directors don't want to do the storyboards because it locks them in, and you say, look, we've got to design this. As visual effects, we also have to budget it because we're just going to make up a budget if we don't have anything that we know, because all of us who work in visual effects know how radically different one shot can be from another, even in the script when it says, okay, that we've got a dogfight in space. What does that mean? Is that 100 shots or is it 5 shots? Are these complicated ships or easy ships? The storyboards also allow a creative starting point. Now we can talk to the director about it once we get it on paper. It also allows us to plan techniques and start the process because we can start building the miniatures and so forth. And it also allows a certain room of flexibility. We can look at it and everybody goes, okay. And then on the set, the DP, we work with him or her and set up the camera and work that out. So there's a certain amount of flexibility. Now, the previs side of things, when it works, it's great. But a few things to be aware of. Well, I'll get to the good part first. Obviously, the previs gives us an even closer definition of the director's vision. So it encompasses the timing and the motion information, so now we can see how that works. And ideally, it allows them to do a rough edit and use something for stand-in footage so they can start editing. Now, as we heard on Edge of Tomorrow, they did full previs, but still the director and the studio could not decide on the third act. So once again, it goes back to story, getting the story concepts as solid as possible, and then getting into this. Now, some of the downsides of previs, everybody assumes the previs is accurate, okay, and they see previs. Now, sometimes the previs is done before they select the location or design the sets, but everybody looks at it, and since it's all moving, they think, okay, that's exactly the way it has to be or will be, and it's not. Sometimes it's a lot better now, but there were days past when previs, they'd make the things whatever shape or size they wanted. I did a project with the London Eye. We found out partway into it, luckily before we went and shot the plates, that they had scaled it to half size because it looked better. It was compositionally, it worked better, but they failed to tell us because we were planning. So there's a time when you can cheat things and there's a time when you can't. Just like with other projects, I've had match movers go ahead and say, well, that didn't match, so I changed the model. I stretched it and pulled it apart just so I could make the match move work, but obviously would have to redo all that. Some of the other problems with previs can be the fact that the cinematographer, visual effects supervisor, and the stunt coordinators may not be included in that. Sometimes the director sat down with the previs people or the storyboard artist, sans anybody else. And the previs people, most of them are great, and the storyboard people, but it's really helpful if the director of photography and the visual effects supervisor and the stunt people, because I've seen things where the previs worked out something and you go on the stage and then they go, oh, well, we're just going to do this stunt like this, and you've got a stunt coordinator who's skilled and has experience with it, and he should have been involved designing those things. And the other problem that you sometimes run into, the directors want to direct it to the nth degree. They think they're now directing that movie, and you have to understand what level of them going for. Oh, can he smile a half second earlier? And you're going like, this is just a guide for us. And it depends on its purpose. Sometimes it is actually a pitch viz or something like that. And in terms of changing things, like some of the Van Helsing shots, we discovered on the set that the camera would be 10 feet underground. So, like I say, I always, need to make sure everything's correct at this point. The other thing, sometimes we and the filmmakers become too focused on reality, but sometimes the cinematic becomes more important. Just like the sounds in Star Wars. I mean, technically they shouldn't be there, but obviously they make the movie much better in terms of a cinematic experience. The other thing, every director always says, I want it to be photoreal. Now, their movie may not be photoreal, but they want the visual effects to be photoreal. So it's critical that the visual effects and the movie design itself work together at whatever level that is. You can destroy the photo reality if you have too stylized camera moves or your coloration is really wacky or something else, and that takes the audience out. So you need to have a consistent pattern there. And as visual effects supervisors, the hope is that we can work with the director and guide them on those things. The Grand Budapest had some great visual effects, but they were somewhat stylized, but worked well with that film. You've got to design it to work correctly within context. The other thing, we get involved in doing dynamic simulations and trying to do the software and stuff, but a lot of times it may be, in fact, better just to go ahead. Sorry, let me jump back. All right. So, but once again, like ripping the skin, we did a bunch of simulations, and that's how we did it in Van Helsing, but we also went and shot some goo on stage, and that we added in the composite stage to add that little bit more that we couldn't get out of the simulations, and it's, you just have to figure out what's important, what's not. The other thing to mention, a lot of times people think invisible effects, that's the key thing, but it's kind of a myth that invisible or realistic effects are harder than fantasy and science fiction. They're both hard. We know that. As I say, the directors always ask for photoreal. The advantage that you have when you're creating something that's real is the audience will accept it, especially if you as filmmakers do not draw attention to itself. Things like imaginary creatures and other things, they know in the back of their mind that it's not a real thing. So you actually have to work even harder to make those work. The other thing is, obviously, with the real image, you have real references. So just as a frame of reference, if you saw somebody walking down the street with crutches, missing a leg here in a movie, especially if you didn't know that actor, you'd think, oh, okay, you'd accept that. But if you saw somebody without a head, you know that that's not real, even though it's the same technique. Actually, this is probably a little bit harder because we've got to put in the neck piece. But, it's the main thing is trying to work with the director and have them understand, look, what's the story that you need to tell here, and I'll work with you to work that out, rather than sometimes the directors get in their mind, oh, I've got to do this with miniatures, or I've got to do this as a green screen, and you go, look, that's part of why you're hiring me. But part of it is also with visual effects films, understanding the suspension of disbelief, is to try to get the idea across to the audience, hopefully between storytelling and the images that we're providing, to suspend disbelief of things that people know are not real and show that to its best advantage. So good story means, creating a roller coaster of emotion, building climaxes and switches, and it also means creating an emotional connection with the audience. But we've seen quite a few cases of bad visual storytelling where the constant action in your face, the cool choice over the story choice. Is this a cool shot, or are we telling part of the story here? Confusing visuals. I've been on things where it's like, this would be a much better angle, but then the director wants it from a specific angle, but it becomes confusing to the audience because it's not really showing them what they need. And at the end of the day, if there's no emotional connection, you've kind of lost that storytelling. So the visual effects and the directors have to work closely together to try to tell that story as efficiently and as correctly as possible. As I say, a lot of times people now with digital, since everything's possible, then they try to load it up with as much as possible, and they try to outdo the last film that was in the theater last weekend, and it just becomes a thing rather than designing what's the story you have to tell. Here's an example. You get fight sequences. So these days, a lot of times you see shaky camera, rapid cuts going from one to the other, and they're trying to tell the story from a visceral standpoint. Whereas if you have a fight sequence like choreographed by somebody like Jackie Chan, then you'll have anticipation, you'll have the rise and fall of action, you'll have the reversal, surprise, you can see what's coming up. Whereas a lot of times these days you go, who's that? What's going, what? And then, it's over. So it's a little frustrating to me to know the potential and then seeing it being wasted in terms of both time and energy by all of us doing the visual effects. I'll just touch on some of the current. I'm just hoping we can try to work with the directors better, and some of the directors are more visual than others, but that's part of our jobs, is to try to work with them to get those. So some of the current developments, obviously there's been motion capture, performance capture, facial capture. We've got still plenty of development to do and plenty of innovation. So some of the other areas, obviously more powerful, more refined tools. We've got more automated functions to handle the time-consuming task. more powerful mobile devices and tools. I mean, we talked about the difference between previs and doing the actual visualizations, but as the CPU time increases and the tools increase, we're going to be doing more stuff in real time, although up till now, at least, we keep increasing the complexity. So we've not gained much. It still takes 2 days to render. It still takes, whatever it does, but we are seeing things move ahead. We're also seeing more integration with live action tools, and hopefully we'll see more in the future, just like we were talking about before with the metadata. We're seeing more virtual production, which gives the production a certain amount of flexibility and so forth. Now, one of the things with virtual production, I'm involved with the Virtual Production Committee, which the ASC and the VS and a number of other groups are involved in. You've got the blurring of the lines, and you're already seeing that, as we've heard before. You've got like the art department's now doing 3D models. You've got pre-production, production, post-production, kind of blurring and circling back and forth. Now, there's already starting to happen some business and politically turf wars in these areas because you've got the actors wanting to hold on to their rights to their CG character. You've got the Academy rule changes, and different people want to be involved in that. Now, unfortunately, visual effects is not organized, not as a trade association, not as a union. The only thing we have at this point is the Visual Effects Society. So while the camera union can push for certain things, or the SAG can push for certain things, it becomes very difficult for us as a visual effects community to push for certain things. Looking ahead to future storytelling, you've got video games, which obviously are already happening now. You've got virtual reality, you've got immersion experience, and you've got special venues, ride films and so forth. I directed a couple of show scan ride films years ago. So video games and some of these other things, they're a different type of storytelling. They're not standardized narrative storytelling. So one of and there is a lot of visual effects work there and overlap and so forth, but it's trying to figure out how to tell the best stories there, and is it just an immersion experience or is it a narrative experience? And these are showing Oculus Rift, so that will be something coming on strong here probably in the next year or two, given some developments that I'm aware of at least. So it's just trying to figure out what's the best way to storytell. Is that a different type of storytelling than the narrative? Is that more like a play versus a movie versus a novel? Those are things that we're going to have to flesh out, both as storytellers and as visual effects and as directors and filmmakers and so forth. Because you've got the interactive and flexible user experience versus the storyteller-defined experience. So, trying to make an emotional experience, or are you trying to make it immersive? Can we do both in an effective way? And if so, exactly how does that work? So just to sum up some of the visual effects innovation summary, enables a much higher quality level today in digital than you could in analog. I mean, I don't mind saying that. Certainly in the days of optical, you'd spend a lot of time just to get rid of the matte lines and things. So it provides much more options and much more control. And because of all of that, because of digital, we can now concentrate as visual effects artists more on the art form rather than the technical issues. We don't have to worry about that matte line so much because we know that we can go ahead and take care of that. We know that we have the flexibility of moving the camera and so forth. And I guess the thing to keep in mind is to try to keep the design simple and try to do it in the simplest manner possible, and not get too caught up in trying to do 200 layers if you can do it in 20 layers. And obviously there's a lot of interesting potential new developments with new media and new technology. The other thing that the visual effects innovation has ended up with, it allows the filmmakers full freedom of storytelling. Because obviously story and storytelling is ultimately what it's all about. Otherwise, as I say, it just becomes eye candy. And shot design is still important. If we're just going to spew out 2,000 or 3,000 shots and just try to flicker those at the audience, it will be lost. So we want an experience that the audience can emotionally feel, and we want them to respond and remember that experience, hopefully. And it's a better, from my viewpoint, to have the option of old and new. So I get the opportunity, because I've done miniatures and other types of things. I can take a look and say, oh, well, we could do it this way, or we could do it that way, or do it that way, rather than just saying, okay, we've got to do this digital, and that has to be sim, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just saying keep your options open, and for those who've only experienced digital, make sure you understand photography and, a little bit of hands-on model building and other things is not a bad thing. It's unfortunate that we're losing most of our model shops in this day and age, and that most of the techniques and ideas that we had in the past are somewhat being lost and not being necessarily mentored to the new generation of visual effects people. So those were the key things, but and I guess we've got time, I'm going to go ahead and discuss some of the innovation versus business and a few other things that aren't necessarily so technical in nature. But, at this point in visual effects, we've got creative control and we now have the technical control. But one of the problems that we're seeing is the studios are kind of losing sight of filmmaking. Yeah, it's always been a business, but now it's been kind of fixated to everything else. And they've become focused on the short term. And at this point, most of the movies coming out, certainly out of Hollywood, are tentpole movies. They're focused on sequels, remakes, and reboots, although Edge of Tomorrow is a new thing, but obviously if that does well, there'll be Edge of Tomorrow too. Like I say, it becomes a little bit frustrating because we see them churning out some of the same type of stuff. And I have people ask me all the time, wait, wasn't that the same creature in that other thing? One of the problems you run into is sometimes the same directors and certainly the same designers of spaceships or creatures or whatever are hired for all of those films, and at a certain point they start looking very similar. We're also seeing a lot of audience fatigue. This year the box office numbers are down like 20%. And what the studios don't understand, they're losing audiences to other forms of entertainment. Obviously these days you have television, you have the internet, and quite a few other options to do. And they're trying to make everything a home run. It's like they're trying to do something that covers everybody. It's like an ice cream company, and they go, okay, vanilla's our top seller, so we're just going to make vanilla. We're going to stop making chocolate, vanilla, everything else. And all the other ice cream manufacturers saying, okay, we're just going to sell vanilla because we make the most money. And part of that is because the studios are dictated by the accountants. But obviously from an audience or even from an ice cream taster, you would not want to have vanilla, all the time. So I'm just going to touch, I think Scott Ross talked about this last year, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly here. The other thing that we're seeing in terms of visual effects is the profitable studios have convinced companies and states to give them free money, okay? And the winners at this are the studios. It's not the taxpayers, it's not us as visual effects artists, it's not the visual effects companies. People may think it is them, but the politicians now decide to some extent where the visual effects are going to go, right? Because that's where the money is traveling to and from, and that means that's one of the reasons why you see all these companies setting up shops in other countries or other states so that they can get the subsidies for the studios. So it does us no good as visual effects artists in the long term or for long-term stability or for a long-term career. There's a lot of people like myself who've had over 30, 35 years of experience, and the work in Los Angeles is gone, okay? And we see the same fate happening to some of the other areas of the world, because as soon as one place lowers their subsidies or another place increases theirs, then everybody's moving. We're moving like migrant workers, not because we want to or because there's other resources there. We're going to be working the same office space, but because a politician has agreed or changed the numbers such that the studios are playing these games. The other thing to realize, we're all working project to project. Some of us have been fortunate to work at a company for a number of years, but it's an ecosystem, and there's only so many visual effects movies and so many visual effects shots. And the whole project to project means that you've got, another project starts next week, so even if you're laid off with this, you finish that project, you can go on and work at another project, in another couple of months somewhere else close by. But right now, since the work's been split up and sliced and diced all over the world, there may only be one or two other places in town, and you may be out of work for 6 months or a year. You may have to go halfway around the globe. So the other problem is right now the visual effects community is not totally united. We're somewhat splintered. So the next step, we've got the technical innovation, we've got creative innovation. So the question is, can we innovate for visual effects survival? That's going to be the next round of innovation that we have to do. Otherwise, I see some we're already seeing a lot of problems, and we're going to see more in the near future. But just trying to have a career in this, because as you can see, it all started out, certainly for me, as a very fun thing, very, I'm focused on the work, focused on the creative issues and so forth, and technology. And a lot of this business thing tends to be very distracting and tends to keep you from potentially a long-term career in this business. So, all right. So,
We still have time for questions?
yes, yes. So,
Thank you very much.
you're welcome. Thank you. So, questions? What's? Oh, sorry.
Just wanted to say you're my hero, not only because you developed the Cloud Tank process, but also you worked on Blade Runner, and it was the movie that made me come into this domain.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering, last year, Scott Ross told us a little bit about the problem with the artists today and salaries going down, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I still don't understand why there is not a union for, at least in America, for visual effects artists. I still don't understand why they don't come together and have a union and be a little bit more strong.
Well, the funny thing is, on Close Encounters and Star Trek, I was in the union. Actually, even at ILM, I was in the union for the 20 years I was there. See, because in the old days, we worked for the studios. So at that time, originally the studios had their own effects departments inside, and they had their costume department and the rest of it, and they were a factory, and every week they'd have another movie that they were working on type thing. And then in the 60s and 70s, they basically sold their backlots and got rid of most of the departments. And then it was freelance after that. And so for a movie like Close Encounters, Spielberg would say, okay, we need to do this. And essentially we were set up as a specialized crew, just like the live action, but we're in a warehouse and we're doing this, and Doug Trumbull calls up, a dozen people, and they bring in other people and assemble a crew. And we built the equipment, rented the equipment as we could. We built the special tank, and that tank was used for every other movie you've seen with, Raiders and other movies, Independence Day as well. So So we were paid by the studios. I was in the camera union. I'm still in the camera union, and we had the matte painters were in the art union. You know, everybody was in their different unions. And it's as digital came to pass, especially at that point, people were in high demand. So a lot of the young digital people said, I don't need any of this union stuff. Disney's calling me, these other companies are calling me, and they're offering me a high price gig. So I don't need any of that. And, as soon as there was a flood of workers, then all that kind of disappeared. And the problem now is every visual effects person thinks that they're unique and they're doing something creative and something, they're rebel, right? But you look at the fact that the writers, the directors, everybody else in Hollywood is unionized. Even the producers are now unionized. And there's a point for that, because you now have, at least in the US, you have health and welfare. You get residuals either directly or indirectly. So even as an assistant camera person, if I go work on a commercial tomorrow and then work on a feature, I'm still getting paid into my health insurance, right? And the producers know that they hire those people because they're skilled. They've already shown their skill level so that they're more than happy. That's why you don't see the major studios going out and hiring 100 film students, because it's cheaper, because they understand we're spending tens of millions of dollars. We got to have this done right. But these days, everybody kind of has an independent. I'm independent, even though they're with 100 other people doing the same job at the same thing. It's not to say that you're not independent, but you have to understand you've got to work as a group to do certain things. And the other point is, it's not just the U.S. UK is, they can have a union. New Zealand, just about everywhere in the world, you can have a film union. China's about the only place that I think dictates that you cannot have a union. So, I think technically you can. Yeah, but everybody is all, well, dare I say, Warner Brothers came in and said, here's some money. We want you guys, to do The Hobbit, but you give us even more money and you change your laws a little bit for us. And that's what happens is today, the corporations are basically paying government, politicians and stuff to kind of get what they want. And it's, up to us as individuals to try to get by with that.
Can you do something? I know you're talking about those, having conferences about these issues. Can you do something?
Well, I'm involved with a group called ADAPT, and we'll probably be announcing in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I suppose. So there is a plan to try to put a stop to the subsidy war, because that's essentially what it ends up being. And then that way the studios and directors will choose which place makes the most sense for them. Each company then can compete against each other, and then that will at least allow a certain amount of stability. And then we can focus on things like the union and the rest of it. It's just most of the visual effects people don't realize the need for that until they're being laid off at like Digital Domain or Rhythm and Hues collapses, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody want questions about some of the old films or old techniques or,
First of all, thank you for the conference. It was really interesting. And I'm just wondering now, when you have the choice, do you still go for like old school technique? Can you still manage to do it and to convince people to use old school technique when you think it's better than doing visual effects?
Well, yeah, obviously it depends a lot on the director and the studio that you're dealing with. In some cases, the directors want you to do it in miniatures because their buddy told them it can only be done in miniatures. And I try to go into each project just with a clear mind. What do you want to achieve? What's the flexibility you have? And et cetera, et cetera. Now, part of the problem and part of the downside to digital is It allows everybody to hold off on making any real decisions till the very end. Whereas if you're doing miniatures, you build it and you shoot it. It's like live action. That's it. That's what you got to work with. So everybody tries to play the waiting game until the very end, and okay, now I can change everything, which does us no good either, because we're dealing with, I mean, that's the other problem with the whole visual effects model, is because we're working with fixed bids and we have fixed deadlines. See, on something like Close Encounters, they would say, how much is this going to cost? How long is it going to take? And Doug would say, well, that's going to take us a year and a half or whatever. And lo and behold, they figured their release date after that time. Now the studios come in and say, okay, it's coming out the 22nd. We know it's only 4 months away, but last time we did one in 5 months, so now you can do it in 3 months. Or, you know, it's that type of mentality. But yes, you can go ahead as long as you're clear with them on the pros and cons and what the advantage will be to them, you know, which technique to use.
Thank you. Hello, Scott. Thank you very much for being here today, because you're one of our heroes of visual effects.
You're welcome.
You've been 4 years. And I wanted to ask you, you briefly mentioned that many model shops are disappearing. Do you know at this point how many model shops are still running, and if there's any chance for movies coming up like the upcoming Star Wars movie, there are going to be models? Kathleen Kennedy, I think, mentioned that, but I don't know if...
Well, okay, so when George Lucas moved ILM into San Francisco, he got rid of the model shop. And the model shop became Kerner Company, and that went through a few generations. So there's still a few people, and once again, you're talking about people who are extremely skilled and experienced in doing model making. And that, you know, it's kind of a lost art, because those people, you know, you're not getting new people in, and the other people are either retiring or now trying to teach classes or doing something at least to earn an income. So there's Kerner Company, and then there's New Deal Studios in Los Angeles. And Fawn Davis and a couple other model builder I know from Vancouver is now working with them. They're one of the few places left that I know of that still does models, you know, just that's the way it is. And you know, like I say, there are certainly a lot of advantages, and you know, to the models and putting on the textures and things. It's just amazing what they can do with, you know, just a piece of plastic or plaster Paris or something else. But people have forgotten that possibility. As I say, for Phantom Menace, we had the largest model crew ever for that show. And, you know, we had all of these buildings that were beautiful and built to match, and we would just photograph it there and line things up, and then they would composite. I mean, and then you know, it was a fun process, because you actually have something interactive that you can deal with rather than everybody pointing at a screen. And for Phantom Menace, we also had lots of vines and other things, and try to take advantage of that fact. And I had them put berries on just to break up some of the bushes, but one day we came in and the ants were taking each of the berries and plucking them off, because those were actually from model railroad sets, you know, like the little oranges and apples, and evidently those are the same thing that your sprinkles you put on your ice cream or cupcakes. So that's why you don't see any berries on the bushes in Phantom Menace. So.